Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to our webinar series from JASCO. This is Dr. Carlos Morillo, and today I'm going to be your host. Today we have Dr. Leah Pandisia talking about UV VIS and NIR spectroscopy, fundamentals and applications, and how to get good data. A little bit about Dr. Pandisia. She worked for a medical device company as a chemist for a year before she went back to school and received her PhD from Drexel University. There she worked in a spectroscopy lab studying biophysical chemistry, and she's a spectroscopy application scientist at JASCO for circular dichroism, UV VIS, NIR, and fluorescent spectroscopy. And with you, Dr. Pandisia. So Leah, go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos. And welcome everyone. Thank you for attending another webinar of our series that we've been doing for the past 2 to 3 months. I hope everyone is well and safe. So today I'm going to talk about fundamentals and application of UV visible near-infrared spectroscopy, a guide to best practices in getting good data. JASCO Corporation, or the Japan Spectroscopic Company, was founded in 1958 in Tokyo, Japan by a Nobel laureate spectroscopist. And today our headquarters and factory are in Hachioji, Japan, with our Americas office located on the Eastern Shore in Maryland. While the first instrument developed by JASCO was an IR spectrometer, we now offer a wide range of spectroscopy and chromatography instruments, including the topic of today's webinar, UV VIS near-infrared spectroscopy. So today I'm going to go over UV visible spectroscopy theory basics, instrument design and components, sampling and experimental guidelines, and sampling accessories and some related applications. The range of applications for UV is enormous. We can probe solutions, powders, solids, and films of biomolecules, semiconductors, nanostructures, and other materials. UV VIS is used for quantitation, color analysis, thermal stability, molecular structure, and substance identification, just to name a few. When a substance is irradiated with electromagnetic waves, phenomena such as absorption, transmission, reflection, and scattering occur, and the spectrum produced reflects the interaction of waves of a certain wavelength with objects of a certain size, such as molecules. The UV VIS near-infrared spectroscopy can be divided into the ultraviolet, visible, and near-infrared regions of the spectrum, depending on the wavelengths used. The ultraviolet region is typically measured from 180 to 400 nanometers, the visible is 400 to 800 nanometers, and the near-infrared is 800 to 3200 nanometers. The larger the wavelength, the less energy involved, so chromophores that absorb in the UV region of the spectrum require more energy than chromophores that absorb at, say, 700 nanometers. But what is absorption? So absorption occurs when the frequency of the incoming light is equal to the energy difference between a molecule's ground and excited state. The excitation of an electron from the ground state to the excited state is an electronic transition. The energy difference of each ground-excited state pair corresponds to an absorption band, and the relationship between the energy difference and the wavelengths can be described by the Planck Equation, where E is the energy required to promote an electron from the ground to the excited state, H is Planck's constant, nu is the wave number, c is the speed of light, and lambda is the wavelength. Planck's equation demonstrates that the less energy needed to excite the electrons, the longer the wavelength of the absorption band. The absorption bands are indicative of the molecular structure of the sample and will shift in wavelength and intensity depending on the molecular interactions and environmental conditions. These bands are typically broad and featureless due to the numerous molecular vibrational levels associated with the electronic energy level. UV VIS spectrometers measure the amount of light absorbed by a sample, or the ratio of the incident light to the light that is transmitted through the sample, and the relationship between absorbance and transmittance can be shown by the equation below. Aside from transmission and absorption, UV VIS spectroscopy can also measure the reflectance of a sample, or how effective a surface is in reflecting the total amount of incident light. Reflection occurs when light strikes the material surface and causes a change in the direction of the light wave. There are two types of reflectance, specular and diffuse. where the sum of the two components is the total reflectance. Specular reflectance is light reflected at the same angle as the incident beam, and diffuse reflectance is light reflected off in many different directions. So now I'm going to get into the instrument itself. The principle of measurement for a UV VIS instrument is relatively straightforward and consists of a light source, a dispersive element, a sample, and a detector. So light from a source is introduced in the monochromator, collimated, and directed through an entrance slit, or it's incident on the grating. The grating rotates based on the wavelength selected and diffracts the light. The light is then refocused by another mirror onto the exit slit, where it adjusts based on the bandwidth specified. The light is then refocused by another series of mirrors to the sample, where it's either transmitted or reflected by the sample and collected by the detector. The figure here shows the optical configuration of a typical Kernsey-Turner type monochromator, where the light is diffracted off the grating and directed to the detector using collimating and focusing mirrors. This Kernsey-Turner design differs from a Litron monochromator, which is a transmissive design and uses a grating to refract the light instead. There are a few types of spectrometer optical arrangements: single, double, and dual beam. In a single beam configuration, the monochromator, sample, and detector are arranged in series, and obtained monochromatic light with the intensity I0 radiates a sample, and the transmitted light with the intensity I is detected. And again, the ratio of the transmitted to the incident light, or I over I0, is the measured transmitted. So although the optical system here is relatively simple, it's easily affected by fluctuations in the light source, and a blank measurement is required every time. In the double beam configuration, monochromatic light is divided into two separate beams by a beam splitter. One beam passes through the sample cell into the detector, while the other beam passes through a reference cell to the detector. The light source intensity changes with time, so the reference beam monitors the lamp energy and accounts for energy differences from voltage fluctuations, lamp drift, and stray light. By splitting the optical path, the incident and transmitted light can be measured simultaneously, incurring little to no effects from light source fluctuations. Therefore, the measured absorbance is the ratio of the sample beam to the reference beam. Dual beam instruments differ from double beam instruments because the reference and sample beams are collected by two separate detectors in a dual beam instrument, rather than the same detector in the double beam instrument. All 5 V700 series models offered by JASCO are double beam instruments. So on the left is a representation of the sample compartment for a single and double beam instrument. In the double beam instrument, the photometric value, or the absorption or transmission, depending on which mode you're measuring, is the ratio of the sample to the reference beam, so any fluctuations in the light source are canceled out. However, in a single beam instrument, since there's only one beam, a ratio of the intensities cannot be acquired, and you see the influence of light source fluctuations in the spectrum. So these fluctuations are visualized in the figure on the right, which depicts the light intensity as a function of time for a single beam and double beam instrument shown in red and blue, respectively. So you can see that as time progresses, the signal intensity in the single beam instrument begins to decrease, while the double beam spectra provides a constant light intensity throughout the entire time. So there's a broad range of light sources and a few things to consider when evaluating your instrument choices. So first, what is the operational wavelength range required for an application, or where does the sample's chromophore absorb? What is the required light throughput? If the sample absorbs a lot of light, you want a brighter source so more light is collected by the detector to provide a better signal. What is the stability of the source? Does the light output fluctuate enough to affect your data? And then the lifetime and the cost of the source. The longer the source lasts, the less money that's invested to replace it. So JASCO spectrophotometers use deuterium and halogen light sources. The deuterium lamp is used for the UV region from 190 to 350 nanometers and lasts roughly 2,000 hours, while the halogen lamp covers a broader spectral range from 330 nanometers to 3,200 nanometers and lasts about 1,000 hours. So both the deuterium and halogen lamps used are continuous sources, although the D2 is also a line source. In continuous sources, the arc created excites the molecules enclosed in a vacuum to a higher energy state. The relaxation of the electrons back to the ground state emits photons, and as the electrons return to the ground state, the excitation process restarts, providing a continuous source of light. Continuous sources therefore provide a uniform amount of light through the monochromator to the sample. So on the other hand, the flash source produces spurts of light when triggered, which leads to fluctuations in the light intensity, as well as lower light output and sensitivity. However, these sources release less heat since the filament creating the arc, and therefore the light isn't constantly lit, and minimize photobleaching of the sample. Continuous sources, however, can combat photobleaching through the proper use of shutters, so you're only opening the shutter to actually perform the measure. In the spectral distribution diagram on the right, you can see the continuous halogen lamp, which is highlighted in yellow, produces significantly more light energy than the xenon flash lamp, which I've highlighted here in blue. So now to the dispersive element. We use a grating, which is used to select the desired wavelength range or desired wavelengths required to probe the electronic transitions of the sample's chromophore. So it rotates based on the wavelength selected and diffracts the light into several beams. The direction that light is diffracted depends on the angle and wavelength of the incident beam and the grating's groove frequency, or the number of grooves on the grating per millimeter. So the spacing between the grooves determines the diffraction order of light, or how many beams are diffracted at that particular wavelength, as well as the spectral resolution. The diffraction order of 0 means the incident light angle and the diffracted angle are roughly the same, while the diffraction order of 1 is twice the incident wavelength. The larger the groove spacing, the less diffracted orders and higher the light throughput. Aside from using a grating with large groove spacings, we also use filters in our instruments to remove any higher orders of light coming off of the grating. So the light is then refocused by another mirror onto the exit slit, which is going to adjust to accommodate for the dispersive properties of different wavelengths. So while the monochromator is set to a specific wavelength, the light emerging is not perfectly monochromatic, but contains a range of wavelengths. The total energy at the exit split of the monochromator at a specific wavelength has the intensity distribution of an isosceles triangle. The peak of this triangle is the target wavelength, and the spectral bandwidth is the full width half max of the triangle. The spectral bandwidth is directly related to the slit width of the instrument, and the relationship between the slit width and the bandwidth is expressed by the following formula, where D is the groove spacing of the diffraction grating, theta is the diffraction angle, N is the diffraction order, and F is the focal length. So when comparing instrument performance, it's more appropriate to discuss spectral bandwidth rather than slit width, since the spectral bandwidth accounts for grating resolution and any differences between different types of grating. To differentiate peaks in a spectrum, the bandwidths and therefore slit widths need to be adjusted. So the instrument's ability to separate light into defined wavelength regions is known as spectral resolution. The narrower the bandwidth and therefore the slits, the better resolution. However, since less light is able to pass through narrower slits, the spectrum is going to have more noise. Likewise, wider slits and bandwidths increase the light throughput and therefore the signal, but produce poor peak resolution. So the goal here is to find a balance between the required resolution and the desired signal to noise. And a suggestion for a bandwidth should be about 1/10 of the sample peak's full width half max. So in this figure, the absorption peaks are measured using bandwidths of 1 and 5 nanometers. And you can see that as the bandwidth increases, the peaks collapse and broaden. So to detectors. Detectors are used to measure the transmitted or reflected light from a sample and convert it to a signal. The type and material of the detector is going to determine the sensitivity and the wavelength range of the data that can be acquired. While photomultiplier tubes and silicon photodiodes are sensitive in the ultraviolet and visible wavelength ranges, lead sulfide photoconductive cells and InGaAs photodiodes are used to measure the near-infrared region of the spectrum. So all these detectors exploit the photoelectric effect, where light or photons that are incident on a material result in the emission of electrons. So in a photomultiplier tube or a PMT detector, photons are incident on the photocathode surface, which produces electrons. The initial electrons travel through this vacuum tube where they hit a series of plates or dynodes that amplify the number of electrons for every dynode that's hit via secondary emission. The multiplied secondary electrons are collected at the anode and sent to an external circuit and converted to your output signal. PMTs have a wide spectral response, high signal-to-noise output, and high stability. A photodiode is a semiconductor device, so when the incident photon's energy is larger than the band gap of the material that makes up a photodiode, and in the case for the UV VIS region, it's silicon, the photons are absorbed and the electrons in the valence band are excited to the conduction band, creating holes in the initial valence band. So the photodiode is made up of P and N junctions in a depletion region. So an applied electric field in this depletion region pushes positive holes towards the N junction, while the negative electrons move towards the P junction, building up areas of highly positive and negative charges, thus producing a photocurrent. Photodiodes have quick response time, a slightly broader spectral range than a PMT, and low noise. So while silicon photodiodes are less sensitive than PMT detectors in the UV invisible region, they are a cheaper alternative for applications not requiring high sensitivity. JASCO uses two detectors for the near-infrared region, a lead sulfide detector and an InGaAs detector. So while the InGaAs detector is a photodiode, the lead sulfide detector is a photoconductive cell which operates similarly to a photodiode. However, unlike photodiodes, in a photoconductive cell, the resistance decreases as the light intensity increases, and the measured output is linearly proportional to the input incident light power. The figure on the left shows the D star values for different detectors as a function of wavelength. So the higher the D star, the better the sensitivity of the detector. So in the InGaAs detector, which I've highlighted here in blue, it's more sensitive than the lead sulfide detector highlighted in green, but it has a shorter wavelength range. So while there are other InGaAs detector options, shown here in orange, with extended wavelength ranges, the sensitivity of those is even less than the lead sulfide detector option. The figure on the left, or I'm sorry, on the right illustrates the difference in the signal to noise between our two near-infrared detectors. So in an InGaAs detector, it has higher sensitivity, shown by the D star chart on the left. So the signal to noise is better, while the lead sulfide, the signal to noise is a little bit poorer, but that has the extended wavelength. So ultimately, deciding between the two detectors comes down to the application and then prioritizing sensitivity, wavelength range, and cost. So in addition to single and double beam instruments, there are also single and double monochromator instruments. The single monochromator instruments have a single set of slits, one dispersive element or grating, while double monochromator instruments have two dispersive elements or gratings, two sets of slits, and additional mirrors. So all JASCO spectrophotometers are double beam instruments, so they have a reference and a sample beam. However, we have both single and double monochromator options. We can't discuss UV VIS spectroscopy without mentioning the Beer-Lambert Law. So the Beer-Lambert Law describes how light is attenuated based on the materials traveled through and forms the basis for quantitation using absorbance spectroscopy. The ratio of the light transmitted through the sample to the incident light, or the transmittance, can be converted to absorbance and used to calculate the concentration of a sample, shown by the following equation, where epsilon is the molar absorptivity of the chromophore, C is the molar concentration, and L is the path length. The amount of light absorbed by the sample depends on the number of molecules interacted with, or the concentration. So the more concentrated a sample is, the more molecules are present and the higher the absorbance. Additionally, the longer the path length of the cell, the longer the light travels through the sample, which increases the number of molecules it interacts with and therefore the absorbance as well. So if we want to compare the absorbances of two solutions with either different concentrations or path lengths, there needs to be a constant variable to normalize the data on. And additionally, if we want to determine a sample's concentration by measuring absorbance, and we know the cell path length, we still need to know the strength of the electronic transition of the chromophore. So this constant, or the probability of the electronic transition occurring, is known as the molar absorptivity. Since molecules have different electronic transitions of varying strengths, the molar absorptivity is going to vary depending on the transition being probed and is therefore wavelength dependent. Stray light is one contributing factor to errors in measured absorbance and is any light that doesn't fall under the Gaussian distribution at specific wavelengths. Since UV VIS spectrometers measure the ratio of the incident light to the transmitted light, any light that does not reach the detector is considered absorbed by the sample, since the instrument detector can't differentiate between absorbed and stray light. So it just knows that a certain amount of incident light is coming through the monochromator, and any of that incident light that doesn't hit it, it just assumes that it's absorbed. So the figure on the left shows that higher sample concentrations, when more light is absorbed, there's consequently less light transmitted. And the figure on the right here shows the measured absorbance, or the calculated absorbance as a function of measured absorbance. And with the introduction of stray light, shown by the blue light, the measured absorbance is going to deviate from the Beer-Lambert law, contributing to inaccurate photometric values that are going to be lower than the actual or calculated absorbance. So the use of a double monochromator instrument is one way to combat effects of stray light, since the extra optical components decrease stray light and noise, allowing highly absorbing or scattering samples to be adequately measured. Photometric linearity of an instrument also needs to be taken into consideration, especially for highly absorbing samples. Photometric linearity describes the accuracy of an instrument's absorbance range that can be measured accurately with increasing sample concentration, and is directly related to a monochromator's optics and the effects of stray light. So the image on the left shows the photometric range for our single monochromator instrument, while the image on the right shows the photometric range for the double monochromator instrument. So they have high photometric linearity, 4 in the single and about 6 in the double, but not only do our spectrophotometers have this wide photometric range, but we're also unique in that that range covers the entire wavelength range. So we're looking at 190 nanometers to 900 nanometers, and that photometric range is consistent throughout that whole wavelength range. This graph illustrates the linearity of both the single and double mono instruments as a function of sample concentration, and as mentioned earlier, the additional monochromator reduces the effects of stray light, which increases the photometric range of the spectrophotometer. So in double beam instruments, the reference beam can be attenuated by a neutral density filter to expand the photometric range. The addition of the neutral density filter to the reference beam balances out the absorption by the sample so that the difference in the intensity of the reference and sample beam is not as large. So the spectrum on the left shows a sample where the signal to noise dramatically decreases at shorter wavelengths and maxes out the absorbance at 10 below 300 nanometers. This indicates that the sample absorbance has exceeded the photometric range. However, by attenuating the rear beam with a 1OD neutral density filter, shown on the right figure, the full photometric range of the instrument can be achieved, along with a significantly better signal-to-noise ratio at lower wavelengths. So the possibility of performing rear beam attenuation is another reason double beam instruments are better options when choosing your instrument manufacturer, because in some instruments you have access to that rear or reference beam, so that rear beam can't be attenuated. So JASCO offers 5 models of UV VIS spectrophotometers, which vary in wavelength range and sensitivity. So I'm going to preface this by saying this is a very simplistic diagram, and there are going to be many other factors that need to be accounted for when selecting the appropriate model, but this is at least a starting point to get you thinking what type of model, based on the options I already discussed, where you need to go. So the first thing to think about is, are you doing near-infrared applications? Do you need measurement in the near-infrared region? If the answer is yes, you have to think of 2 options. Do you need a high sensitivity instrument, or do you need a wide wavelength range? So if high sensitivity is needed, you would go with the InGaAs model, which is the V780. However, if you don't need high sensitivity and really just need to get to 3200 nanometers or above 1600 nanometers, then you would want to go with the V770, which is the lead sulfite detector model. However, if you're not really concerned with sensitivity and you don't need to get out to 3200 nanometers and going to 1600 is fine, the V770 would still be a better option due to the price. So if your applications are mainly UV or visible wavelength range, then the first thing you want to ask yourself is, do I have a highly absorbing sample? If your sample absorbs over 3 absorbance units, then the answer to that would be yes, and you would want to look into the V760, which is a double monochromator instrument. If your sample absorbs less than 3 absorbance units, then you need to think, okay, well, do I have a suspension, a powder, a liquid, a solid? And those options are the V730 and the 750, and depending on what sort of samples you have or what sort of accessories you want for your instrument, you would either go with the 730, which is more of a routine measurement system with a more minimal budget, or a 750, which is a little bit more sensitive. So in this section, we're going to focus on sample and experimental guidelines to keep in mind when trying to acquire good UV VIS spectra. So first we will discuss liquid samples, which are going to fall under two categories, clear or translucent and cloudy suspension. For clear solutions, or ones with no particulates in the sample, the transmittance and absorbance are typically measured. These measurements can be done in single or multi-cell holders, which can be thermostated for temperature-dependent studies. There are also additional accessories for measurements where there's a large number of samples through the use of sippers, flow cells, and autosamplers. I'm not going to be going into detail on those today. There are a few things you need to think about when designing your UV VIS experiment for liquid measurement. First, where does the chromophore absorb, or what's the wavelength range being probed? If the measurement being performed is not for quantitation, is the concentration and path length sufficient to observe a signal? Does the solvent used absorb in the same region as your sample chromophore? And is the cuvette material transparent in the wavelength range you're probing? So these two tables list a variety of chromophores, their electronic transitions, wavelength ranges, and more absorptivity values. For samples that are not strongly absorbing, concentrations can typically be kept under 3 OD. So for liquid sample measurements, a majority of the time, the path length of the cuvette used is 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter. However, if you're restricted with the sample concentration and need to reduce the total absorbance due to a limited photometric range, there are a variety of cell path lengths offered as well. When choosing the proper cuvette to use for your application, you need to consider the material of the cuvette and then the volume of the sample you need. So the figure on the left shows the transparency of different cuvette materials. For samples that absorb below 200 nanometers, you will need a quartz cuvette or UV disposable cuvette that transmits light in the UV. For near-infrared measurements, glass or quartz cells are going to be your only options. If you are working in a wavelength range that allows for the disposable cuvette, I would still suggest comparing the disposable cuvette you're using with a quartz cuvette, and that's because plastic itself is still going to absorb. So if you are working at higher photometric ranges and you need higher sensitivity, the quartz cuvettes are going to be a better option. Cuvettes are also broken down into macro, micro, and submicro volumes. So macro cells, the cuvette here on the left, typically requires 1.5 to 4 milliliters of sample. Micro cells require 250 to 1,000 microliters of sample, and here the two middle cuvettes have the walls are tapered to accommodate for smaller sample volumes. Submicro cells can hold 10 to 250 microliters. However, all these volumes that I just mentioned are going to change with the path length of the cell. So these are all 1 centimeter path length cuvettes. The longer the path length, the more volume is going to be required. Another option to mention is self-masked cells. So the micro and submicro cells shown here, which are all the ones in black, have areas of the cell that do not hold the sample, which are coated in the anti-reflection material. So the windows of the micro and submicro cells are typically smaller than a traditional beam dimensions to accommodate for the small sample volumes. And while the bandwidth of the instrument can be changed, and therefore the beam dimensions can be reduced, any light incident on the cell itself that doesn't pass through the sample is going to introduce stray light effects, which will result in inaccurate absorbance values and a reduction in the photometric linearity. The Z height is also another important characteristic of cuvettes. The Z height is the height from the base of the cell to the center of the light beam and will differ for different instrument manufacturers. The Z height for JASCO's V700 series spectrophotometers is 15 millimeters. However, we also offer a cell holder which can adjust the height of where the cell sits in the sample beam to account for small volumes. So the image on the right shows that there's a little ring which you can screw, which will push the cell up so that if you can't fill the cell completely, it will move the sample volume that you are able to fill into the path of the light beam, so the light beam isn't passing through the meniscus or any part of the cell that's not filled with solution. Additionally, this cell holder comes with a mask, so the image on the far right shows a plastic disposable cuvette which is not self-masked. So by adding this mask, it creates an aperture, and again, we can reduce stray light effects here. Solvents should also be carefully selected for UV VIS experiments. The sample should be soluble in the solvent selected and assist in maintaining sample stability. So the sample should not denature or decompose in the solvent. And then this table provides solvents and their respective wavelength limits in a 1 centimeter cuvette. Once we have selected our sample, cuvette, and solvent parameters, we can now begin acquiring data by first taking a baseline measurement. So baseline or background measurement is used to account for the solvent or buffer in the cell. For liquid samples or samples that are dissolved or diluted in solution and use a cuvette, the solvent in cuvette can absorb and reflect light, which can lead to inaccurate absorbance values and lower signal to noise. And this is going to be especially important for quantitation measurements. In this figure, we can see the sample in green, the solvent in blue, and the solvent subtracted sample spectrum in red. And by neglecting to acquire solvent spectra and doing a subtraction, this will lead to incorrect absorbance values. Because here you can see that in the sample, which is the green line, you have a peak at about 1,000 and 1,200 nanometers. However, if you didn't run the solvent, you wouldn't realize that those two peaks are in the solvent as well, and they're not from the sample. So you would incorrectly assume that those are two chromophores being absorbed from your actual sample and not the solvent. So for solids, films, powders, or samples that do not use a buffer or cuvette, the baseline or background spectrum is typically just air and will be discussed in more detail in the next slide. So how are the baseline measurements actually performed? Many new users confuse the reference side of the instrument as the area of the sample compartment to place the solvent or buffer. And while all JASCO UV VIS spectrophotometers are double beam instruments and have a reference beam, the main purpose of it is to account for fluctuations in the light source, filter light source and detector changes, and light attenuation of the sample. It's not solely for baseline measurements. So the equation here shows that since the reference light intensity is canceled when calculating the percent transmittance or absorbance, the same result is obtained regardless of the presence or absence of a solvent on the reference light beam side. Therefore, for most samples, when acquiring data, the baseline measurement of the solvent can be acquired with the solvent in the sample beam position, and then the sample is swapped with the solvent cuvette, and the sample measurement is acquired. That being said, the reference beam does occasionally serve a purpose for baseline measurement. So for samples with strong absorbances, the solvent can be placed in a cuvette in the reference beam for attenuation to balance out the reference and sample beams, since the detector is going to be measuring low light intensities from a highly absorbing sample and very bright light intensities from the reference. Additionally, solvents whose properties change over time, such as oxidizing agents, can also be placed in the reference beam for both baseline and sample measurements. So in this case, two matching cuvettes are used where the solvent is placed in both the reference and sample beam for the baseline measurement, and then for the sample measurement, the solvent is left in the reference beam and the sample is placed in the sample beam. This spectrum shows the signal to noise reduction when you have nothing placed in the sample reference beam, in the reference beam shown in blue, and then when a solvent is placed in the reference shown in red. So the red spectra has better signal to noise than that blue spectra in the shorter wavelength range. Thermal melting studies are commonly carried out in biochemical and biotechnology fields in order to obtain information regarding a sample's thermodynamic properties. So these properties can further elucidate a sample's thermal stability and possible changes in structure and binding. When selecting cuvettes for thermal stability studies, there are some things to keep in mind. So if you are using a micro or sub-micro cuvette but do not intend to fill the entire cell volume, you're going to need to use low headspace cells. These cells have larger stoppers to keep the evaporation loss of samples such as DNA to a minimum. So otherwise, if the cell is not completely filled with a solution and stoppered, the evaporation of the sample can occur inside the cell during the heating process. JASCO also offers a wide range of cells for thermal stability measurements that range from an 8-position, 1 millimeter path length micro cell block that holds 10 microliters of sample per cell. And then there's also an 8-position, 10 millimeter path length cell that holds roughly 100 microliters of sample. And then we also have traditional 10 millimeter quartz cuvettes. So when a cloudy or turbid solution is measured, the light incident upon the sample is diffused and only a small portion of the light reaches the detector. Every detector has an acceptance angle, shown by the pink dotted line on the left, that describes the maximum angle of incident light that reaches the detector surface. So while some light can be scattered and fall within the acceptance angle, any light that falls outside this range does not reach the surface of the detector. And because the detector cannot differentiate between absorbed and scattered light, it assumes that any light that's not detected is going to be absorbed, which results in inaccurate measurements. So for some samples, you can actually move the sample cell closer to the detector to remedy this issue, shown by the figure on the right. So the closer the sample is to the detector, the more light that could potentially reach the detector's face or surface. For cloudy or turbid samples that still scatter outside of that detector's acceptance angle, an integrating sphere accessory can be used to collect the scattered light off the surface of the particulates in the sample. So an integrating sphere is a spherical cavity whose inner wall is coated with a highly reflective material such as barium sulfate or spectralon, which is almost 100% reflective. In an integrating sphere, light diffusely transmitted or reflected by the sample undergoes multiple reflections so that the intensity becomes uniform, and some of this reflected light reaches the detector on the bottom of the sphere shown on the figure on the left. Therefore, the average reflected or transmitted light introduced into the sphere can be obtained, resulting in accurate measurement. In the end of this presentation, as I start to discuss solid sampling accessories, we will focus on two types of measurements, so transmittance and reflectance. The most common accessory for solid samples is an integrating sphere, which can be used to acquire diffuse, specular, and total reflectance, as well as diffuse transmittance. So in addition to the spheres that I'm going to be discussing in the following slides, we also offer a variety of spheres for different applications, such as a gemstone sphere and a horizontal sampling sphere. So as mentioned earlier, reflectance can be broken up into three parts: specular, diffuse, and total. These three components can further be measured as either the relative reflectance or the absolute reflectance. So relative reflectance measures the ratio of the light reflected from a sample to the light reflected off a reference surface, while absolute reflectance uses a light source of a known output as the reference to calculate the reflectance. In the following examples on integrating spheres, the relative reflectance is measured using a white standard plate as a reference. In diffuse transmission measurements, the incident light enters the sample compartment and hits a mirror where it is reflected through the sample sitting at the entrance of the sphere shown in blue. The transmitted light is reflected off the diffuse surface of the integrating sphere and eventually makes its way through a third aperture to reach the detector. Baseline measurements using an integrating sphere are straightforward. You have a white standard plate left at the reflection or back port of the sphere, and the entrance port where the transmission sample would sit is left empty. The spectra on the right shows the transmittance of a sample using a standard cell holder in blue compared to the spectra obtained using an integrating sphere shown in green. Since only the direct transmittance was obtained using the standard cell holder, a significant portion of the transmittance was lost without the use of an integrating sphere. Diffuse reflectance measurements are obtained by placing the sample at the reflectance, shown in this teal color, or the back port of the integrating sphere, shown on the top and on the left. Baseline measurements are acquired the same way they are for diffuse transmittance measurements, with a white standard plate at the back port and nothing obstructing the incidence beam. Diffuse reflectance measurements are typically obtained for powder samples or samples with rough surfaces. So this bottom figure shows a 150 millimeter diameter integrating sphere, which historically was required for international measurement guidelines like ASTM due to its sphere to port ratio. However, the smaller 60 millimeter diameter sphere can now be used for ASTM measurements and has fewer bounces and therefore less noise, while the largest sphere is typically used for larger sample sizes. In this 150 millimeter diameter sphere, the reference beam is parallel to the sample beam shown on the left. So in order to remove any potential specular component, if you only want to measure the diffuse reflectance, a beam trap is added to the sphere to allow the specular component to exit the sphere, shown by that black triangle. So to measure the total reflectance of a sample, the specular component needs to be included, and then the beam trap is removed. Here you can see the effect of including the specular reflectance component for samples with a matte or rough surface on the left, compared to a sample with a glossy surface on the right. So for the matte finish on the left, the specular component, which is going to be the blue, adds relatively little to the total reflectance of the sample, but for the glossy sample on the right, the inclusion of that specular component significantly increases the total reflectance of the sample. To measure the relative specular reflectance of a shiny or mirror-like sample, an aluminum mirror is used as a reference standard. So all relative reflectance measurements, specular, diffuse, and total, assume that the standard surface being used has 100% reflectance. So it's therefore important that the reference plates are kept clean and in good condition, so their reflectance characteristics remain constant and don't lead to incorrect reflectance values. In this accessory, the baseline measurements are acquired by placing an aluminum mirror on both the reference and sample stages, and then the mirror on the sample stage is swapped with the sample itself to acquire the sample measure. The absolute reflectance accessory uses a light source having a known output as the reference to calculate the sample's known or absolute reflectance. Absolute reflectance measurements can be used to obtain both transmittance and reflection data by changing the incident angle and or the detection angle. So the incident light is introduced to a sample which rotates on a sample stage relative to the specified incident angle. The light is either reflected or transmitted by the sample and directed to the integrating sphere. A mirror and the sphere, which also houses the detector, is then rotating relative to the sample stage to achieve the specified detector angle. The reference measurements are performed using a fiber optic cable, which brings the light source out into the sample's accessory, or the accessory sample compartment, in order to ratio the sample to reference beam. So while I would typically summarize what I've discussed for the last 40 minutes, UV spectroscopy is a pretty hard topic to break down into a single slide of bullet points, but here are a few takeaways. UV VIS NIR spectroscopy probes the absorption, transmittance, and reflection of solid, liquids, films, and powders between 190 to 3200 nanometers. Double beam instruments use a reference beam to account for fluctuations in light intensity I0 to provide accurate measurements when ratioing the transmitted to incident light. The Beer-Lambert Law is used to calculate sample concentration and describes how light is attenuated due to the sample concentration, path lengths, and strength of its electronic transitions. Stray light introduces deviations to the Beer-Lambert Law, leading to inaccurate absorbances and therefore concentrations, but can be remedied with a double monochromator instrument. The cuvette material and sampling volumes need to be considered when selecting an appropriate cuvette for liquid measurements. And integrating spheres can be used to collect any scattered light that won't normally reach a detector surface for cloudy suspensions or solids. I'd also like to mention that today's webinar only scratched the surface of UV visible near-infrared spectroscopy to provide you with a starting point for experiments. There is so much more information depending on your application and sample type, but I hopefully planted some seeds on ways to achieve better data and what future possibilities UV VIS can provide for your work. So with that, we have another webinar next week, Tuesday, June 23rd at 2 p.m. It's going to be a live Raman microscopy demo by Dr. Carlos Murillo. If you want to view our past webinars, you can visit our website where we have some webinars on vibrational circular dichroism, electronic circular dichroism, fluorescence, FTIR, theory, and microscopy, Raman microscopy, and SFC, as well as chromatography detector information. We also have some ebooks and tips and tricks posters on Raman, fluorescence, FTIR, and CD, and a knowledge base, which is a database of peer-reviewed journal articles using all of our JASCO instrumentation. So if you have questions on whether your application is used out in the field or what kind of experiments people are doing or how to set experiments up, you can go to our knowledge base and put in a search term and come up with a bunch of peer-reviewed journal articles. So with that, I want to thank you for attending our UV VIS near-infrared webinar, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them. And also, I want to mention that I have two very lovely panelists joining me on your questions, Dr. Sherry Henderson and Joe Burgess, who are also some UV VIS experts here at JASCO. So one of the questions is, where is the detector located in the diffuse and total reflectance measurements? So if we're talking about a sphere, the detector on the sphere is located on the bottom. So I don't really want to go through or go back to any of the slides here because that might take a little bit of time and I think there's a bit of a lag. But in the slide on integrating spheres, it's the one with the blue sphere basically, and it sits on the bottom. So the light bounces around the sphere. You close off the backport if you're not doing reflectance, if you're doing transmittance, and then as the light bounces off the sphere, it averages and it goes through an aperture to the bottom where the detector sits. If we're talking just about regular reflectance measurements and you're just using the standard cell compartment, the light goes from left to right. So it would just sit on the right side of your sample. Oh goodness, these are coming. Sherry and Joe, for lubricating oil applications, what configurations would you suggest? I'm not sure if you guys have seen some of this or have any suggestions there. Cuvette materials made up of which material? So it definitely depends. I personally always suggest with going with a quartz cuvette. But if you have very specific applications, for instance, you're just going to be measuring for quantitation purposes, if you're just trying to look at the absorbance of, say, DNA or a biomolecule, you can definitely get away with a plastic cuvette. If you're going below 200, which if you're just trying to look at nucleic acid or protein concentration, you would be at like 280, 260. You could use the plastic disposable ones, but the quartz cuvettes are going to give you better, they're going to have less absorbance than the disposable cuvettes. So it kind of just depends what your application is.
Yeah, just to chime in on that, Leah, just to reinforce what you said, it's all about kind of cost and everything too, right? If they just want quick and dirty measurements, a lot of times folks will do the plastic cuvettes, right? But if you really need high quality data, that's where going to quartz is going to pay off. It might take more to clean it, especially if you're using small volumes, but the black masked quartz is really the best way to go for your micro volume measurements if you want high data quality.
Right. And again, it's hard to generalize some of these questions because there are so many different applications for UV, so it really will depend on that application. So again, if after this webinar, if anyone has any questions that further need to be elucidated or questions about your application, you're more than welcome to shoot us an email.
Yeah, and even just going back to some more specifics on the, I think you said lubricating oils and whatnot.
Yes.
We need a little bit more color there in terms of what the assist in terms of what measurements are required.
I think you were asking for more detail, right, Joe? Sorry, you went a little in and out.
Yeah. Sorry, more details, correct, more specifics.
Yeah, I agree.
Color used as a pun since this is a UV VIS spectroscopy webinar.
So we have a question. What would you recommend for measuring around 270, 280 nanometers in ultra pure water to detect the easy zone? I'm not.
To detect what?
I'm not sure. The easy zone, easy like capital EZZONE. I don't know if that just means like a good area or if there's actually something specific to that I'm not aware of. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this question correctly, but you could, if you're saying ultra pure water, it's making me think you want a bit higher sensitivity. So I would suggest a quartz cuvette, but I'm not sure if you're actually asking about instrumentation, what model instrument. So I would need more information on that. How large is the diameter of the incident beam? I'm trying to think what that is off the top of my head. Do you guys know what it is off the top of your head? I want to say maybe...
Not off the top of my head.
10 millimeter.
The diameter? Well,
yeah.
It's going to vary. I mean, so we have a whole like spreadsheet on that, right? It varies on your spectral.
Yeah, depending on the
bandwidth.
Right. Collected and.
Right. So you can tailor it, and you can select the bandwidth that on a system that has selectable bandwidths, right? You can.
Right, but
you can vary that
so
that it matches your sample.
Nanometer bandwidth.
Come again, sorry.
I was going to say, if we're assuming a 1 nanometer, so to this question on how large is the diameter of the incident beam, it's going to depend on the bandwidth, because you can vary that. But I would assume for a 1 nanometer bandwidth, that's what they're asking for that question, but I could be wrong again there.
Yeah, I mean, we can double check that. I usually just put a business card in front at the focus and look at it.
Yeah,
I can make up a number, but I don't want to make up a number. You know, it's a couple millimeters.
How to overcome stray light? That's a loaded question. So it depends what the issue is. One of the things you can do is, if you have highly absorbing samples, then you would need a double monochromator instrument would be my first go-to. It depends where the stray light is coming from. Is it something where it's not necessarily the instrument, but potentially the cuvette you're using, in which case you would need to mask the cuvette because the beam is going around the sample itself. You guys have any other suggestions?
Sorry, I was double checking the beam width thing. So I might duplicate what you said, but yeah, overcoming stray light definitely is a problem in certain application areas, right? So, you know, if you have samples that, like you talked about, are highly scattering, are turbid, or highly absorbing, you're going to care more about stray light. So part of how you overcome that, right, is thinking about, you know, what's really important to your research and trying to, you know, use an instrument that provides you the stray light characteristics you need. If you need that extended photometric range, you know, out to almost 8 absorbance units, well, you're going to go with the V760 because it's got the double monochromator, and you'll be able to do maybe optical based measurements with greater confidence, right? Think about it. There's some customers we've worked with who do want to look at quartz optics, and so they really care about that range down around 190, 187, right? Well, to get to the, you know, stray light is going to drastically increase as you go to those shorter wavelengths, right? So as you're pushing the into that further into the UV region, you have to have a double monochromator to have confidence in those measurements at that level, right? Especially higher absorbance measurements, but even just looking at transmission of quartz in that range. So again, very broad question, and if they have a specific application they'd like to talk about, you know, we're happy to discuss further offline.
So some of these questions, the best peak to read bacteria concentration, a lot of these are application dependent. And unfortunately, even between the three of us, I'm not sure if we can adequately cover every application. So it would be more things that I would have to look into. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of the best peak to read for bacteria concentration.
Bacteria concentration? No, I'd have to look that up. I don't know that off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Sure.
While you're looking at questions, did find that chart I was talking about. So it looks like the width of the beam at a 1 nanometer spectral bandwidth is going to be in that like 3 millimeter range of width, right? And then you have a taller beam. It has going to have a height to it somewhere in the like 11 to.
Yeah, that's not a sample focus though. At sample focus, you're roughly looking around either 10 millimeters, 11 meters, roughly at 1 nanometers, with a width about 1 millimeters roughly overall.
Oh, am I not looking at the focus here? Focal point. Oh, sorry, wrong column. Thanks, Joe. I thought it sounded wide. Yeah. Well, so around 1 to 2. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or millimeters. Sorry.
Again,
Thanks,
we have a chart on this if someone really wants to see it, depending on what they're doing overall. And it also, it's good to note too, just think about it. If you're using a xenon flash lamp instrument, especially if you have a self-masked cell too, you have to worry about the energy is not linear across that beam. So you do have to worry about if it's hitting the black and then it changes per flash. So something to kind of keep aware. And then in a continuous, D2 tungsten halogen type instrument, the beam energy is linear across that.
Another question, you mentioned about baseline measurement and reference beam measurement. In terms of actual measuring, do we just put solvent without sample in the instrument first and then put sample to measure? So if we're talking about liquid samples, even solid samples, I would always measure your baseline measurement. So in regards to a solvent, I would put the solvent in the same cuvette you're going to put your sample in, or at least a matching cuvette. Place your solvent in the sample beam, take your baseline measurement, and then obviously clean your cell, or with the matching cuvette, then place your sample into the sample beam and take the sample measurement. If you have a solid, you would just take your baseline measurement using air, so you wouldn't put anything in the reference, and this is again for not highly absorbing samples. I'm just talking about, something that's maybe about 2 absorbance units or not something highly absorbing. So in the case of a solid, you would just take your baseline of air, so nothing in the sample compartment, and then you would put your solid material in the sample beam and do your sample measurement.
Yeah, I can, I'll just add on to that, Leah. Like you said, that's the most common way for liquids, right? And then as you push, let's say we've been talking a lot about high concentrations, right? But as you push to lower concentrations, sometimes to really be able to see stuff kind of in the grass, right, in the very, very close to zero area, there's value in running how you showed on your slide, actually, where you have solvent in cuvettes in both the sample and the reference. And then you simply, I remember looking at super low concentrations where you're pushing the limits of the instrument, and you actually suck out the solution or solvent out of the sample cuvette, right, that you ran your baseline with, and put your sample in there and run again using 2 cuvettes in the front, one in the front and one in the reference beam. Regarding solids, sometimes for solids, especially if you're looking at a difference or if it has a coating on it, sometimes folks will run the substrate as a baseline and then run the sample too, right? So again, that gets it's hard to generalize on these, so we're happy to be available to discuss specific applications. But and it's even more important, I think something I don't know that we talked as much about, right, Leah, is when you have the high absorbance, it's really important to not just do your baseline and then your sample, but you also run a dark, right? So you end up running 3 measurements. You run your kind of 100% line, right, your baseline, and then you block the beam and run a dark current, like just any background noise of the instrument, right? And then you run your sample, and that's probably the best for like really highly absorbing samples.
Thank you both for your input. Some of these questions are a little application specific, which we would be happy to go into detail if you want to reach out to us after the webinar, or I think we might be able to get some emails and reach out to you. But thank you everyone for joining our webinar this afternoon. I hope you all have a great afternoon, and we will see you next Tuesday at 2 p.m. for Carlos's Raman microscopy live demo. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.